Welcome, everyone, to episode 30 of the Single Malt Strategy Podcast. I'm your host, John, the strategy wargamer, and I'm here with Gene and Gary from GMT Games and Playdek. How are you guys doing today?
Great. Thanks for having us
Doing
on.
well, man. Thanks for having us.
I'm really appreciative you guys joining us. I know it was, it's we had to work out some of the scheduling to get us all together, and I really appreciate you guys coming on the show. It's a really incredible opportunity. So I guess I'm going to jump into it because I'm really excited to have you guys on the show. You guys made an announcement a few months ago that kind of like put the whole strategy gaming board game industry in shock because you guys made an announcement that you were planning to bring the GMT catalog of strategy games to the digital platform. And my first thought when you guys made that announcement are you guys planning to bring the entire or the majority of that catalog to the PC, to the digital platform?
No, I don't think that's possible. GMT's got so many games available for Playdek to approach that. I mean, we're probably capable of doing right now 2 or 3 games a year, maybe more if we grow a little bit, but certainly not. At this point, GMT's publishing almost 30 games a year, so keeping up just with the new stuff coming out. And what was really impressive for me to see about the aftermath of the announcement was so many people came out and offered up, this is a game I need you to do first. And everyone had a different opinion, and they're games that I wasn't even aware of in the GMT catalog that I had to go back and take a look at. Like, oh, that one would be interesting. Like, could we do that? But there's just so many of them that we really have to kind of pick and choose and decide like which one's going to have the most impact and, satisfy the widest group of GMT fans.
This year, you guys are planning to release in 2018 two games that you were mentioning that you're planning to bring to the digital platform. What are those 2 games?
So the one we announced that we were planning for 2018 was Labyrinth. That will most likely be early 2019 at this point, just because we're almost at the end of the year and we still got a lot of work to do on that one. And then the original announcement was then that we were planning on having a coin game, one of the coin games, and Imperial Struggle in 2019. And so we don't know what the impact on the schedule of Labyrinth slipping a little bit will be. And, we're still working towards that goal, and we'll see where we get. So that's what we've announced to this point is 1 game this year and 2 games.
So I'm kind of curious, why Labyrinth? It's a really popular game, but I wanted to, out of your entire catalog, which is hundreds and hundreds of incredible games, why did you guys choose Labyrinth per se?
So something we focus on is overlap in implementation, right? So we already had Twilight Struggle, which we built, an engine to play that game with its 100 cards in the deck and all of its nuances. That Labyrinth is very similar in how a lot of the card play, the interactions take place. And so in addition, what we're looking for going forward is more games that implement a automated player, right? Which GMT has started to focus on, but Labyrinth was the first one that they did an automated player for and had great success in publishing a game that was a 2-player game, but you could also play on your own when you were solo. And so for us, that gives us a leg up on developing an AI because we have a crutch, right? The solo player can be implemented. It's one option for a player to learn the game. We can make an effort to develop an AI, which for Twilight Struggle, we have one. Some people are satisfied with it, others are not. And so that gives us, multiple options for solo play when you don't want to play online against somebody and you just want to sit at your computer or with your iPad and play the game. That was a big plus for us, was that we didn't have that option with Twilight Struggle. And now we do with Labyrinth. We've implemented both of the bots already, and we can get a lot more feedback from solo players without having, put the work in yet to get a competent AI.
So going back to Twilight Struggle, why did you guys choose that game specifically when you guys, this is basically the first game that you guys made as a partnership, right? If I'm correct, that you guys kind of did work together on. Why did you guys choose that particular game?
Because there was a guy named Randy who was never going to be happy unless they did it.
Yeah, so Randy was a Playdek employee, and he and another employee at Playdek would play Twilight Struggle on Vassal every day at lunch. And they fell in love with the game. They go home on the weekends and get together and play the board game. And so as we were ramping up, with Playdek back in 2011, there was a lot of, land grab going on. Find the games that we want to do, sign the licenses for them, bring them in house, and then we had a lot of choices of which games we wanted to work on. And so one of the games they were pushing for was contact Gene, who we'd never met before, had no connection to. Contact Gene Billingsley and ask him about the possibility of doing Twilight Struggle. And unfortunately, Twilight Struggle was already licensed out to another group, and so instead we'd settled on doing Commands and Colors, and that was the license we received. But it got stuck in the backlog of having all these titles coming in and the choices we made about which games we could develop at a given time. And so as it lingered, Randy kept pushing for go back and ask about Twilight Struggle. The report from GMT in their monthly email is that it's not going as well as they had hoped, and so there was a push to contact Gene and talk about this. And so Joel Goodman, our CEO, eventually called up Gene and said, we want to do Twilight Struggle. There's a possibility for that. They worked out a plan that involved us giving Commands and Colors back because we hadn't made any progress on it. And we got Twilight Struggle instead out of that deal.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I was always very curious because this game really, for me, when you guys announced that it was coming to iPad, it was, at least for me, it was a big deal. There's a huge community behind this particular game, and there's so much, it's extremely popular, and at least for my board game community, this game is very popular. So when you guys brought it over to the digital platform and then soon after the iPad platform, it was a huge thing. One question I had was when you guys released Twilight Struggle, did you guys intentionally see that it was going to come to the iPad, or was that just after you released it on Steam that it was, that it was just after that you said, let's bring it over to the mobile platform?
So before we released Twilight Struggle, all the games we'd done, I think we'd done 10 games to that point, and they'd all been iOS on a proprietary engine that we developed, starting from almost from scratch years ago. And so as part of the development of Twilight Struggle, we had switched over to wanting to use the Unity engine because it gave us far more tools for our artists to develop. Like we had a lot of difficulty with our existing engine that they wanted to do all these cool effects, and it just wasn't possible without a lot of programmer time to implement, the tools that they needed and the engine code to handle that. And so by moving to Unity, we gave them far more freedom. Now our artists can sit and build an entire front end for one of our games without any programmer input, just in a system that we've built within Unity. And so it frees them to be more creative without relying on a programmer holding their hand and making sure they have the tools they need. And so that was one of our goals with that project, was to get up and running on that. And we were still able to use a lot of the core components we had built in our own engine in a plugin into Unity. So we didn't lose a whole lot of what we thought made our games, unique. And so that was a big win for us. But it meant that we also opened up then to having access to PC and other platforms. So we had done iOS and Android previously, but our Android, the port to Android didn't run so well on certain devices. And we had done a PC version of one of our games, but it was not very well received either. And so we just didn't have the bandwidth to support all these platforms on our proprietary engine and develop new games. And so switching to Unity solved all those issues for us. It was now took a little time to figure out the different platforms. Once we had it up and running for Twilight Struggle, it's been very easy to get that then working for each of our other titles once they're running on the Unity engine.
So I'm kind of curious, moving a board game over to the digital platform is it not a light, challenge. It's an immense kind of I guess opportunity, but also, task. So what kind of challenges did you guys face porting Twilight Struggle to the digital platform?
So there's multiple issues or multiple problems that need to be solved. First and foremost for us is just getting a rules implementation that's as accurate as possible. Obviously, we run into some issues with certain nuances of the game that we can't implement as fully or correctly due to the constraints of the digital platform. And so we have to try and find a way to work around those types of issues. The interface, once we have a rules engine in place, the interface is very important to us, how it looks and how it feels, and that the information that's presented to the user is what they need to see, that we don't want the screen cluttered with a ton of information because some of it isn't necessary until they want to view it, but they need to have quick access to bringing up a pop-up or an overlay that shows them the information they want, and then can go back to playing the regular game. And then for me, it's developing an AI is always a very challenging component, especially with a game like Twilight Struggle, which has so many possibilities for what the choices can be and the paths that the game can take.
Kind of leapfrogging off what you just mentioned, the artificial intelligence, the AI, um, in regards to that system, how difficult is it to implement artificial intelligence and AI to kind of replace a human player? Because when you starting a board game, you have two human players and they're both provide a challenge to one another. To kind of take one out of that loop, um, and put a computer there. Um, I'm kind of curious, how difficult was it to develop an AI to kind of mask, to kind of replace that human player?
It's always a difficult undertaking, especially with any of GMT games because they're so much more complex than a lot of the other board games that are being converted over. That it takes a lot of time, a lot of patience, a lot of especially in our AI system, a lot of tracking of why is it making certain decisions and trying to understand where deep down in the possibilities of what it's considering is it making a certain choice that doesn't necessarily look like the choice that you would want to make. And then the a lot of the techniques for building AI tend to be a black box where you build something and try and train it or let it learn how to play the game, but when it makes the decision, you don't really have much control over going in and looking at those numbers. That why did it learn to do this thing in this particular way? And so,
Well, I noticed when I was playing Twilight Struggle, so I'm not I'm not probably like the best person to ask, but because I guess I'm not like probably the most sophisticated strategy gamer, but uh, I guess I've noticed when I was playing Twilight Struggle, the AI is actually really competent. It's doing a good job. So it does feel like you guys put a great deal of work into that, because I mean it took care of me numerous times where I had to end the game in failure. So I feel like honestly you guys did quite a bit of great work with that.
thank you. And that varies from person to person. There's obviously the top end players who still want to try and get a competent game out of it. They're not getting what they need, and so they just need to play online or find another solution. The point to make building the AI is to try and get something that's competent for the beginner to play against and the mid-level player against, and hopefully, get something that the high-end player can also enjoy. But we build the AI with letting it play against itself over many iterations. A lot of processing going into just letting it play and try and learn different things. And so some of the things that decides on is unfortunately comes out of playing against itself. And so if it's not making intelligent moves to challenge itself, it doesn't learn certain nuances of the game. And clearly it's learned some things to do some things correctly. And in other cases, it just doesn't handle it that well. And so there's a lot of times where it'll get a hand, and like in particular in Twilight Struggle, it calculates out as far as it can see and tries to get like a broad look at what its different possibilities are, but there isn't enough computing power for it to get all the way from the beginning. If it's at the beginning of a turn, early, like an early action round, it can't see the end of the turn. And so there are cases where it doesn't realize necessarily that holding a card until a later turn is bad until it's too late to get that out of its hand. And so that's why you'll see some of these cases where it gets DEFCON, hits DEFCON 0 or DEFCON 1 inexplicably. But one of the tools we have, as I mentioned with Labyrinth, is that it has this automated player that we've implemented now. And so what we gain from that is, instead of having the AI learn by playing against itself, it can learn by playing against the automated player until it's picked up enough positive techniques until it can do well against the automated player. Then it can start to play against itself and use those as kind of a cross-training tool to learn how to both beat itself and beat the automated player, which for the feedback we're getting on the early version of both the US and the Jihadist automated player, they do pretty well against the testers that we're currently using. So it's a pretty competent system for playing the game, and we can use that now as a training tool to try and jumpstart our AI learning.
The thing that's impressive to me is that Gary plays these games. Not everybody does, but he played Twilight Struggle and played it with Randy. It's not an easy thing to understand what good play looks like. And I think without immersing yourself in a game, I don't know how people do it. I don't know how AI programmers construct these things if they're not intimately familiar with a game. But it impressed me that Gary did that, and he's done it again with Labyrinth. Yeah, we actually played once and he beat me, so I'm not very proud of that really. But it told me that he had been doing his homework, and so it's also why the sharks out there, the top level players, think the AI isn't quite good enough, and that's just Gary's fault. He's just not that good a player. But I'm sorry, Gary. I think he created something that is astonishing, really. The depth of play required to be good play in Twilight Struggle is a significant challenge. And just outside looking in, hats off. You did a great job.
Thank you.
So I'm kind of curious. This is a personal question, and Matt's gonna come at me for this one, but I gotta ask. So, what was it more easier or more difficult to develop this game for the tablet, the iPad? Because I don't think, did you guys release this for Android yet?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it came out. It launched on PC and Mac via Steam when it was first released to the public. It came out 4 or 5 months later for iOS, iPad only, and then it came out for Android tablets, I think, the following December. So like another 5 or 6 months. And that I guess it came out at the same time as the Turn Zero expansion was released for Android.
I worked for Apple, so I'm a big promoter for their for iPad and such like that. So I'm kind of curious, was it more easier or more difficult to develop for the mobile platform than it was for the PC, or where do you feel that?
I don't think that any one particular platform was more difficult than the others. Like we primarily developed on PC because it was just the easiest way for us to debug and kind of build out, have a lot more screen real estate to just throw things down and see what worked in the UI and play around with it a bunch before we had to shrink it down a little bit. And so that was our goal, was just to get the PC and Mac versions done first. And then because we had this Unity engine, switching over to iOS, there were a number of issues, especially on like older iPad devices. It did not render very well because of the solution that worked great on PC, but on iOS, I mean, the first time I ran the iPad version, I think it was running at 5 frames a second, and you want at least 25 or 30 even for a board game to feel responsive when you touch it. And so like understanding like why was Unity, the system we were using within Unity for rendering everything, why was that taking so long, and kind of breaking things down, and really there's a long learning process of being one of our artists. Run it on PC and it runs a smooth 60 frames a second, and you go over to the iPad, and I guess we were running an iPad 2 at the time. And so there was a long learning process that went into kind of figuring out like what was the bottleneck and why couldn't the graphics processor in that handle what we were trying to do. Android, we never really had performance issues, but there was just there's a lot more kind of library work that needed to be done, importing the Android libraries and kind of getting all the pieces in place, and understanding like push notifications are done differently on Androids. That took a fair amount of understanding to get those working. So there was work involved there as well. And so if there was one that was the most difficult, was the PC version, because that involved building the game, right? Once we had the game done, it was just, what's the differences to get to the other platforms, was just because PC came first. And so that's kind of the approach we've taken with all of our, the games we've done afterwards. Once we finished Twilight Struggle, we've gone back and have been working on some of our other non-GMT games to port them over to the Unity engine. And then Labyrinth will be the second GMT game now that we've started and developed entirely within Unity to get completed. So we have it. It is running on PC, and that's the version we're using for beta testing as we go forward at this point. But we do have it running on iPad. We went up to the weekend of the warehouse in October at GMT, and we had it running on several iPads for players to take a look at an early version of it. And that was just because of the ease of Unity allowing us to port between platforms.
So I know we jumped into Twilight Struggle on iOS, and we jumped into announcement. I feel like I kind of went too far forward. So I had one question that before I wanted to start this whole interview process is, how did this whole partnership originate? Like, when and how did you guys get together and decide, hey, let's do this thing. Let's get it done. Let's bring our great titles to the digital platform. How did you guys, work, get together and work this out?
You want me to take that one, Gary?
Go ahead.
Well, from my side, we were predisposed to like Playdek because of the work they did with Twilight Struggle. We thought it was an absolutely brilliant digital adaptation of our best game, or at least our best-selling game. So, we had talked about several others, but Playdek was, they had a lot of games that weren't our games that they had to do as well. And so we kind of figured, well, we'll just wait in line, and when they're ready to do one, that's great. And then one day, Joel called me and said, we've been thinking about the possibility of maybe just doing GMT games exclusively. And after I took a couple beats to make sure I'd heard that right, I said, I'd be in favor of that. And he laughed and I laughed. And he said, well, let's sit down and try to make it work. So at that point, we started talking about games. And I've tried with both Gary and Joel to like pre-screen games for them and help them think about, what lines would work. And I'm not completely ignorant of the reuse of code and things that are important to programming teams. So with 300 titles or something like that in our catalog, there's no way that Gary's not going to live long enough to do all those games, and we wouldn't want to. They're not all really good fits for digital platform. But if I could go in and say, all right, let's look at the Coin Series games. Those are big. I thought that they would do well. And initially, we're just kind of trying to feel for what should be next and what we could do. And so we looked for, what was the next game after Twilight Struggle going to be? And I gave them a list of 4 or 5 games that it could be. But because of system similarity, if you know our games at all, you know that Labyrinth is very much built on the Twilight Struggle engine, but so is 1989, and so is 1960, Making of the President, and we have several other in the CDG line that could use that core code and wouldn't be out of bounds. And so I just tried to help them think through what those might be. And every once in a while, I've mentioned a game 5 or 6 or 8 times to the point that Joel finally just gave up and said, "All right, fine, we'll do that one." At some point. But that conversation happened, and then about 3 to 4 months after, we came to a final agreement. And I can't tell you what was going on inside Playdek because Gary could get you that part. But from our side, it was a very easy conversation, and it was really just centered around how are we going to make this work for Playdek so that they get basically to cherry pick the best of our line. That we give them games that have the best chance of success out in the marketplace. And what are those games? And that process, by the way, continues to this day. Is every time we get together, we're talking about, what's it look like now? What other new game have we done that might be a good fit for Playdek? So your turn, Gary.
So from our side, it just made sense. We'd had a lot of success with Twilight Struggle. We'd done very well for us. We kept getting the feedback from Gene that the release of the digital version had just spearheaded sales of the physical game. That they had sold through an entire print run within a month after the digital version came out, and it's because people were happy to spend $10 to play through the tutorial and play against the AI a little bit to learn the game, to understand it enough to know they wanted to go and buy it. And so looking at all of GMT's other games, there's so many of them that I think people, not necessarily the core GMT gamer, but the people on the fringe are kind of put off by the size of a coin game. It's this big box with a thick rule book and a huge playbook and all these different nuances. Until you understand one coin game, you can't play any of them. And so like having that as a possibility that we can use this as a teaching tool and push, give players a learning option for a reasonable price that then they can decide that, once I learn how to play my first coin game, now I'm comfortable enough to pick any of them up. That's true of most of the games in GMT's catalog. They're just more complex than the average Euro board game. And the only reason that I think a lot of people avoid them is because of it's a daunting task to get the first one under your belt. So now they've played Twilight Struggle, that whichever one comes next, now that they're familiar with it, maybe that's a good fit. And so it just made sense to us from that standpoint, and also from the standpoint of we'd worked with a lot of different publishers in the past, and there's always been a kind of a push and pull between them, which one gets the attention next. And so rather than making Gene wait, because he's always been very patient, but at the same time we'd been successful working together on the game we'd done together, that it just made sense to push forward and try and make a deeper partnership.
So you guys mentioned that that you guys came together to develop Twilight Struggle. Was Twilight Struggle like a test case, like a precursor for this announcement, for this this huge initiative that you guys were planning on? Were you guys planning to put like Twilight Struggle out there, see how it did, and then if it did well, if you were gonna make this announcement, which you did a couple months ago?
Not at all.
Not at all. I think it was more a case of we did Twilight Struggle because it made sense. It was the GMT's best-selling title. We loved the game to play the physical game, so we knew we could do a version of it that people would enjoy. And it was a year and a half, 2 years after that before we were even deciding on which game we wanted to do next with GMT. And there was we'd signed 2 games actually, I think. Before we even got to the point of trying to do this deeper partnership.
Oh wow. So one question I had was because moving to just doing one GMT game is huge because the GMT catalog is rich and you guys have so many award-winning games. I look at it. I don't even bother going through the catalog because by the time I go through you guys' catalog, it's just like I got like 20 or 30 in my cart. And I'm like, okay, I can't do this. I would just literally go bankrupt. So
Always stop at 15. Just 15 and you're done.
That's a good round number. So my question that I have for you guys is, when you guys decided to do Twilight Struggle, did you see your community, your fan base? What was their reaction to you coming out with Twilight Struggle and then making this announcement for making more titles to the digital platform? What was their reaction? Was there support? Was there apprehension, hesitation, anything like that?
So way back when we first started, when we announced there was going to be a digital version of Twilight Struggle, this was a different publisher who had it initially. I think the board game community was very wary about that. They didn't. If they wanted to play computer games, they'd go play Civ, or they'd play a computer game. Twilight Struggle was their board game, and it was almost a cult following in some ways, in a very small pond. And so, I think there was a lot of hesitation, reluctance, wondering could somebody really do this? And the longer the project dragged out, the kind of the worse that got. And giving it to Playdek, was pretty much the smartest move we ever made. And then the proof is in the pudding. It came out, and I don't know, Gary, your view might be a little different on this, but what I heard from the community is the Sharks, the guys that play this in tournaments all the time and are top 100 in the world, they weren't really happy. They looked at it and said, immediately began to pick at what it wasn't. Well, the AI can't beat me, or this card isn't implemented correctly. And for those of us in the board game hobby, it's just kind of a shrug. We're used to that. We're very detail-oriented people, board gamers, and there's kind of that tendency to pick. And so it's okay. But that was the response from those guys. But then, and that was kind of the initial response because those guys went in and bought it early. But then we started getting this groundswell of, I bought it just to play the tutorial, just to learn how to play the game. And guys would say, I've had Twilight Struggle for a year, the board game, and I never could get the time to sit down and really learn it well, or I couldn't get an opponent to play against. And they said, I spent $10, and in 30 minutes with the tutorial, I know how to play this game. And now, now I can enjoy the board game. And we heard that again and again and again. And we also then heard, the Shark, the really good players, they were like, oh, this AI just isn't good enough. And then we're hearing from almost everybody else, well, it's beating me 3 times out of 4. And it beats me once in a while. Now, and I'm not a terrible player, but clearly I'm not as good as Gary. So I think overall, over time now, the response of our customer base has been, thank God you did Twilight Struggle as a digital game. It's really, really good, and they like it. But I think it was a long process, and the proof's in the pudding. I think what really won them over was the slickness of the UI that Gary and Jeff and all the team there put together. I mean, that is a really slick user interface. So, and I think our customers recognize that.
I have to jump in. I completely agree. The way you guys did the user interface on Twilight Struggle is amazing. It's absolutely beautiful. I think that game, the way you guys kind of ported it is like a work of art. I play it a lot, just like looking at it on my iPad, and I'm just like, wow, this actually looks beautiful. I mean, like, you guys put considerable effort into that, and as a fan, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So we were mentioning that in regards to the fan community reacting for you guys bringing Twilight Struggle and the other games to and more games coming to the digital platform. How much of that board game community did you see trying out Twilight Struggle and being a promoters of more board games coming to the digital platform? Do you see kind of like almost like a migration of board gamers moving over to the digital platform? Because there's a lot of pros and cons, I guess, in regards to that, because with board games you have to set up a time and place to play Twilight Struggle or what have you. But with board games, with you guys teaming up together, we could play these legendary games anytime, anywhere.
Yeah, I think Twilight Struggle in particular is a really good case for the digital version, because it's the game that people always tell me, I want to play it, but I can only play against one other person at a time. And so whenever I get a game group together, I never have one person come over. I have 5 people come over. And so we got to choose a 4 or 5 player game to play. And so Twilight Struggle never gets played. It's too long to play as a filler, right? I can't just have one guy come early and play against him for half an hour and then everybody else shows up and we play our bigger game. It takes 2 hours just when you sit at the board to play through that. And so it's just, it was too difficult, I think, in a lot of cases for players to consistently get it to the table, even though they wanted to play it or they liked the game, just based on their particular schedule or availability for when they can get together to game. If you can't make it to the GMT weekend twice a year, then you just don't have the option to play some of these much larger games. It's Here I Stand takes 6 hours to play, and you really have to have 6 players to enjoy it. That might be the type of title that we would look at because of that component to it, where it makes it more accessible, right? And at the same time, you have to look at what are the interactions that take place during the game. Twilight Struggle, a lot of times you get your action round and you play one card and make the choices for it, and you can make your choices and then undo and kind of think through all of your different possibilities, but you don't have to commit what you're choosing to do. And there's nothing your opponent can do that needs to interrupt, right? That there's no response. Like when you play your card, he can't play a counter spell or whatever to it to immediately in response to it. Like unless you're going to play the event, your opponent's event, and kind of give him the opportunity to resolve it, to do what the event card says, you have your turn to yourself, to work with. And so there's a lot of decision that goes into that, and then you turn it back over to your opponent for them to do the same thing on their action round. And so there's other games, I think that to use a non-GMT example, like I've been playing Magic the Gathering online recently, and there's so much interaction between cards that you can't have the asynchronous version of that. You have to play that in real time, and kind of be every card you play, you wait for your opponent to say, yeah, okay, you can resolve that, or I get to throw another card down in response to it. And that there's the back and forth to it slows down a digital version, especially in cases where if you had more than 2 players, where you have to wait for every player to kind of chime in and say, I want to play a card here in response to your card, or skip it, go ahead and pass, And so that becomes cumbersome in terms of the timing, where every little thing you want to do has to wait for a response from 5 other players. Really doesn't make for a good digital experience. So either we need to change the flow or the rules of the game to accommodate that, to make it work a little bit better, or we choose games where when it's your turn, you kind of make all the decisions that you want to make through the end of your turn. And if there might be some opponent decisions that take place in that, either we find a way to interleave them, or in some cases we've delayed those decisions until once you're done with your turn, then it goes to the player who gets to make that choice and kind of pushes it off until you're completely finished, so that we aren't constantly interrupting your decision making for that other player to make a choice.
So my take on the migration is that it kind of goes both ways. I don't know that there's people migrating just from board games to digital, or just from digital to board games. The long-term problem that those of us who play war games and strategy games for many, many years is the opponents wanted problem. Now, I have to say that's gotten a lot better. With the advent of BGG and board gaming itself is kind of in a renaissance right now. You see a lot more people playing face-to-face games with game nights every week, all kinds of more conventions than we used to have. So for a two-player game, as Gary's right about Here I Stand, that's tough to get 6 people together. But for a two-player strategy game, you can absolutely play a lot of Twilight Struggle as a board game. I think a lot of people got exposed to how to play Twilight Struggle through the tutorial in the digital version, and then went out and, well, we saw the numbers. They went out, 22,000 of them went out and bought board games after that, and now they're playing them with people. So I think it's given them that opportunity. But one of the best things that Gary and the team did is building an asynchronous version, because that really does solve the opponent's wanted problem. And although I hear griping once in a while about you don't give us long enough to play, or you don't give us short enough to play, or whatever the crazy timer rules are, I think for most of us, the async version lets us play with anybody we want to play with anywhere in the world, pretty much on our schedule. And so I think that's a beautiful thing. You know, in Spanish they say, ¿por qué no las dos? You know, why not both? I don't think it's a choice that you have to play the board game or the digital. Why not both?
I guess for me, like, I have a lot of friends that are board gamers, and before, I guess a couple of years ago, I guess it was 2014 when I was kind of reintroduced into board games. The last time I played with board games was back when I was probably a teenager, back when Axis and Allies, was kind of going mainstream in New York City. I was reintroduced back in 2014, and it was really incredible to get into the games. And my one of my buddies who still works at Apple, he has entire shelves of just GMT games, GMT games, GMT games. And one thing that I really love about your company is I always flip over and I'm like, wow, this is incredible. And we talk about the game for literally an hour or 2 or 3 hours. I'm like, you can do this, and and Lee can do that, and Jackson can command a core, and it gets me so psyched about it. But the only problem is like, comes down to time. Is I always mention to my friend Bob, I'm like, hey, when can we play this game? And he's always replying, is like, well, I don't have time today. I don't have time, tomorrow, maybe next week. And I think by this partnership that you guys are doing is going to revolutionize this problem that we're all having. I love getting together with my friends and having a board game night. I think there is no, I think that's like an incredible experience. However, I feel that you guys having this partnership and bringing some of these key incredible titles to the digital platform is gonna, allow us to play our favorite games when we don't have the time to play them, time to get together and do that. So I'm really excited and really thankful for that. Was that kind of like in the back of your heads that you guys, when you guys were first getting together, like, hey, this is kind of like why we want to do this partnership, and is this was this one of those original reasons?
Well, from my side, there's a benefit to the customers, and we wouldn't want to do this if we didn't think we could bring huge benefits to customers. So from that side of it, yeah, absolutely. That we one of the things we want to do is help people play our games more often. And so the async version, especially, you can play anytime you want. And we feel like that our games are high quality. And so the more people get introduced to those, the more they're going to tell other people. And, the games, the quality of the game speaks for itself. So that's all good. But the other side for me that was really influential is, well, you have to decide who you want to work with. It's not just the customer side, it's who's your partner. Well, we just felt very comfortable from the Twilight Struggle experience that Playdek was a group of people that we wanted to work with going forward.
The team that you guys have, part of this huge initiative that you guys are doing, this huge project of bringing these key games. You were mentioning a while ago that in regards to Playdek and GMT Games, is Playdek solely going to just publish GMT games now?
We still have other games that we've published that are from other publishers that we're supporting going forward, and so we're doing expansions for several of them, and we have other work that's not GMT projects, but we haven't announced any new games coming beyond the ones we've announced with GMT at this point. So
the development team that you guys have is are you guys working as kind of like a combined whole? Like, do you have like people from GMT and people from Playdek working together side by side to start developing these new games?
When we first get going, our artists will get together with GMT's production guys and get the art and the assets that we need to kind of build the first pass at the interface, and then we kind of go off on our own and work independent for quite a while to try and get something playable, a workable version of it. And then we get GMT involved again. At this point with Labyrinth, we've got quite a few of them that have the Steam or the iPad version, and they're providing feedback that we're trying to address as it comes in. And then it's not necessarily working together side by side every day, but there's a lot of here's the latest version, and what do you think, and what's on your hot list now of the things you need to be addressed next as we go forward. And then we all make a decision together as it gets closer to done. Is it ready? Is it ready to release to the public?
So
from my side, what I try to do is just make sure that they have all the assets that they want or need to properly do the game. So, Gary has access to the designer of Labyrinth. Volko's pretty much willing to help him anytime he needs to. And I don't know how much you guys have had conversations, Gary, but I would imagine it's been significant in terms of treatment. And sometimes in that figuring out how rules work, we can jumpstart them just by giving them access to our community. And certainly the play testers and all that comes as well. But they mostly do it, honestly. We just give them the resources they need to frame it and then to test it. And the rest of it's their magic. The guys that play that.
So, Gary, you were mentioning that there's going to be a Steam version, but I think you mentioned that you said there was going to be an iPad version?
Yeah, for Labyrinth, we're targeting Steam and Mac first, but it is running on the iPad at this point. We haven't spent a whole lot of time trying to make it work well on that small screen, but we went up to GMT hosts twice a year a weekend at the warehouse where they have 100 or more loyal GMT fans come out and play board games for 4 straight days. And so because it's only a 5-hour drive for us to go up there, we've made it the last 3 now I've been to, and I think our plan is to try and make it to each one going forward. And so we took an opportunity to bring the latest build, but it wasn't feasible for us to bring 4 PC laptops or 4 PC computers, and so we got it running on the iPad and just took it up there just to see, the one of the other actually it was Trevor Bender, the designer of the expansion to Labyrinth, said, at the weekend of the warehouse, everyone's used to seeing a prototype. They're not used to seeing a finished product. It's everyone bringing their work in progress to show it off, and so no one's going to be too concerned about something that's incorrect in a prototype version. So we took it up, and anybody who wanted to come by and push it around a little bit was welcome to do so. So we ran a small tournament and got a lot of good feedback on the interface and the direction we were taking with it. And, now we've made a lot of contacts as well to try and get people in as beta testers going forward.
do you guys foresee a future when every majority or pretty much every board game that you guys publish or release, that you also see a companion digital version of that game?
I do not. I think we do too many games. We have 57 design teams, and those guys are busy, and they do great games. So we're not going to tell them no. But that means 20, 25, 30 games a year for us. That's just we'd have to be working with 10 different digital publishers to make that a reality, and honestly, we don't want to. And I think probably if you said we did 20 games in a year, I think maybe 5 of those might be really good candidates for digital. And even at that, I'm not sure we'll ever get to all those with Playdek. But right now, what we can tell you is we're basically letting them cherry pick the best, what they think is the best and what we think is the best, to bring the best of our games to customers on a digital platform.
Do you also see a way that a customer can buy kind of like I guess, a bundle where they can buy the board game version and it also comes with the digital version kind of thing?
Joel and I have had a couple conversations about maybe looking at some cross-pollination that way down the road. No promises. It's interesting. I think it would be interesting if we could make it work for everybody. But I don't know yet.
I guess the last few questions that I have, I don't want to keep you guys too long because I know we're rounding off to about an hour here. The last 2 questions I have, the first one would be, what kind of board games do you see that would not work on a digital platform? I'm just kind of curious because you guys made some, you guys are pushing, the coin series, and another game would be the Imperial Struggle that's coming over to the digital platform. Do you see any games in your catalog that would not work at all on a digital platform?
Well, I think most of our games would work on a digital platform, but the question for us, and I think for Playdek too, is what works profitably and what works efficiently. And so they have an engine built that handles card-driven games. Twilight Struggle is, one of our card-driven games. So it makes sense to us to utilize that engine to do other GMT card-driven games, which is one reason you see Labyrinth. I think there's no reason that some of our smaller hex and counter games couldn't be good games on digital. I just don't think there's as big a market for that. And right now, there's not an engine to drive those games. So if either of those things changes, we get a big market for some of those hex and counter board games, or we get an engine that will run them, then sure, they'd work. But I think in the meantime, we're looking at card-driven games, coin series games, and then maybe once every few years, something new. What's your perspective on that?
So I think games with a heavy social component don't work necessarily as well unless you've built some better communication tools between players. Like we have the ability for players to text chat between each other at this point, but there's no voice chat or any kind of private communication channels to set up. And so not that GMT necessarily has any of the party games or that those kinds of more social interactions included in the games. But as I mentioned previously, games with a lot of pausing for someone to interrupt, or respond to what it is you want to do, I think really present a lot of issues in terms of the flow of the game. And so while we wouldn't necessarily rule out any game that has those kind of features to them, I think they present challenges that need to either be dealt with from a very early design perspective or find some way to work around them. But beyond that, like even I've built plenty of games on a hex map, just none of them for Playdek. So I know how that type of feature would need to be implemented in the game, and so I wouldn't necessarily rule it out. It's just a question of what's our bandwidth, and which title is the one that we all agree on should be next in the queue.
The reason I ask is because I guess for me personally, there's a couple of games that in the GMT catalog that kind of stand out well, not stand out. I mean, they all stand out, but that I guess for me hold a higher interest than others. Your Civil War series, numerous games in that series, as well as like even the smaller conflicts. I guess in there's a couple of games I was looking at recently, which I can't find on my thing. Number one, I would say the Civil War series, but also like 1916, Making of a President. That's like to me like a huge one. So I'm just kind of curious: would all those kind of games, the Civil War series, even the hex-based games that you guys have, be a consideration?
I wouldn't rule anything out. As I mentioned earlier, we got a lot of feedback when we first made this announcement, and everyone had a different opinion on which game they wanted, and so it's just kind of sorting through that and trying to figure out, what's the best course to take with the next choice.
So you guys are like, the community is pretty much what's kind of what you guys are kind of being, what you're taking your feedback from.
We're including that feedback for certain, but there's a lot of factors that go into choosing which direction we're going.
At the end of the day, for 28 years we've always listened to customers, but we're the ones responsible for making the decisions that keep the business going. So you consider what the customers have to say, you weight that, and then you use your best collective judgment. You get team members to give you input, and out of all that, somebody has to make decisions. And at this point, at the end of the day, if Joel doesn't say, yeah, this is the one we're going to do, then it doesn't get done. And all the rest of us are very cooperative in terms of how we frame our suggestions and give information and give perspectives. It's a very open environment. So the customer part of it is a piece. The feedback is a piece. But I'd say another huge piece of it is just our best judgment about what works best for us in Playdek.
Okay, awesome. That's all my questions. I don't have anything else that I can ask. Is there anything that you guys wanted that I missed that you guys want to add in, and or any kind of things that I missed?
I thought those were good questions.
I think we've covered most of it. So,
okay, awesome. I really appreciate it, guys. This announcement, definitely made huge waves in the strategy gaming industry. I know me and Matt, the historical gamer, who was not able to join us on this podcast, but I know me and him discuss this all the time, and I know I discuss this with my friends every single day. This is monumental news, at least in my world. I'm very excited for what you guys are planning to release. But yeah, so I wanted to say thank you for that, and thank you for coming on this show. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you guys taking the time out, and I really look forward to the games you guys are going to make, and thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, John. Take care.